So welcome to the Passion Project Workshop. The goal of our workshop for roughly the next hour or so is for all of us to work together to think about strategies that we can use for two things. One thing is obviously to stand out in college applications. That's pretty much the reason why most of us are here. But here at Meridian Prep, we're also really interested in having our students make a difference in their communities and making sure that you feel like you have agency and you can make changes, real changes in the world. So before we get started, let me tell you just a little bit about us, perhaps. So as I mentioned, my name is Sheila Vatan, and I'm one of the founding members and counselors at Meridian Prep. And Meridian Prep is a counseling-owned and counseling-operated company. And I think as a result of that, we're really dedicated to what we like to think of as holistic counseling for college admissions. So obviously, we're concerned about the things that everyone else is concerned about. We're worried about grades. We're worried about test scores. We're worried about, your essays and, the grammar of those essays. But we're also thinking about our students as a whole. And I think that this workshop is really a part of that. We want to sort of get an understanding of the whole person and figure out who you are apart from maybe what's super obvious in your resume or in your application. If you have any questions, please feel free to chat them in the chat box. I may not see them right away. And if I don't see them right away and one of our other counselors isn't able to respond to them, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask for clarification. Otherwise, as long as we have time, I'm going to spend a few minutes at the very end to answer any questions that you might have. If something comes up at the end of the workshop and you have a question or you're uncomfortable asking at the time, please feel free to email me at svatan@meridianprep.com. Okay, so let's get started. There's a term maybe that you have heard of that's used by Stanford admissions officers. It's this idea of a standard positive student. And there is something about this term that feels a little bit condescending, and I think maybe it's meant to feel that way. And it's an issue I think that a lot of students face. It's a student who is positive. Their general trends are good, they're doing good things, but otherwise seems a lot like everyone else. So let's just take a student that for me might be pretty standard as well, a type of student that I see a lot. So let's think about that student. Let's say that the student is someone who gets mostly A's with a couple of B's. So they've got an unweighted GPA of almost a 3.9. So just a few B's, not too many. And they've taken some difficult courses. Maybe they're interested in engineering or computer science. So they've taken classes like AP Calculus, and they've taken, let's say, the two AP Computer Science courses, AP Principles and AP Computer Science Applications. So their weighted GPA, if they've taken those, is probably going to be close to a 4. They've taken the SAT maybe one time, and they scored pretty well for a first shot. They got in the mid 1300s. And apart from those basic stats, which I think we would all agree are pretty positive, they're also involved in some extracurricular activities. As I mentioned, they're maybe CS kids, and so they're thinking about robotics, and they're involved in the robotics team, let's say VEX at their school. And maybe they're also involved in a sport like track and field, and maybe they've been able to make varsity their last year or two. And maybe the student once a month is able to go volunteer at a homeless shelter, and they basically gather canned foods and distribute them to the community. On the whole, when we look at the student, I would say that this is a pretty strong, it looks like a pretty strong profile. I have a lot of families who, if they were to look at the student, they would say, yeah, this is pretty good. What else are we supposed to do? So I think it's worthwhile to think about this profile in the context of the many profiles that colleges receive. So the United States has something like 27,000 high schools, so almost 30,000 high schools, public and private. So when you think about that number, this profile back here, this you person, with a 3.9 and a few APs, they're probably in the top 15% of their class, maybe top 20, depending on the school. So when you're looking at 27,000 high schools in the US, that means there's 27,000 valedictorians in those schools alone. There's always going to be someone who's the best at that school with the highest GPA. And if you're looking at the top two, so the valedictorian and the salutatorian, that's 54,000 students with just those stats alone. And let's say you add on top of that the test. You say, look, well, yeah, sure, my GPA isn't perfect, but I got a pretty decent test score and it was my very first test, and I bet I could do even better. So when you look at just the SAT alone, last year in 2022, there was something like 1.7 roughly million SAT test takers. And when you start looking at the percentile scores, so the percentage of students who do better than you, or the percentage of students you do better than, out of 1340, you're at the 89th percentile of actual SAT test takers. And what that means is that 11% of that 1.7 million did better than you did, which is actually close to something like 200,000 students. So 187,000 students scored better than you did on the test, which is a pretty grim characteristic. And it feels a little bit grimmer if you start thinking about that in the context of the top schools, because so many students that I talk to are really, really interested in sort of like top 10, top 20, maybe top 25 programs. I'm going to talk a lot about those schools in this presentation because that's what a lot of people's interests are. I'm not saying that these are necessarily the best schools in the world, or that you have to go to these schools to be successful. But because they're so aspirational, because students love them so much, we're going to talk about them a lot. So let's just take the top 5 schools alone based on US News rankings. So, we just said there's something like 50,000 valedictorians and salutatorians in the United States. There's something like 187,000 students who scored better than you did on the SAT. So if we look at these schools, these top 5 schools, number of accepted students these last years. Princeton accepted something like 1,500, MIT around 1,300, Harvard around 2,000, Stanford just a little bit more, and Yale just a tiny bit more than that. That means the top 5 schools are accepting something like 9,300 students. And that doesn't even account for the overlap. That is to say, the students who applied to both MIT and Harvard because they love the Boston area, and both schools accepted that particular student. And some of you might think, well, you know what? I mean, a 3.87, sure, like I can't change my GPA too much, but I can maybe do better on my SAT. And maybe I got something in the like 1,500 range. And that's actually like the 99th percentile. So let's take a look at that. So if you get a 1,540, you're in the 99th percentile. But again, if you break down those numbers, 1% of 1.7 million means that 17,000 students actually scored at your level or above. So you're still competing in this huge, huge group of students. So definitely when you're just looking at numbers, it can be really hard for applicants to distinguish themselves, especially when they're competing for some of these more selective school programs. So now we have to think about, okay, what about the other stuff? We were talking about robotics and we were talking about track and field. Like, how do those things work in college applications? And so I think it's worthwhile to take a moment and think about how admissions works. And you guys have probably heard the term holistic admissions. And one thing that I want you to be aware of as we're talking about admissions is that it's not just about getting the right numbers. This is a quote from a former Princeton president. And notice the language here. Never again will you live with a group of peers that was expressly assembled or gathered or created. This group was created to expand your horizons and open your eyes to the fascinating richness of the human condition. And the two things that I really notice in this is the power of admissions, right? So these schools are creating a student body, and the student body, they want a student body that's going to be diverse and in which students are going to be learning from each other. And they want to expand each other's horizons and open their eyes. Okay, so that's kind of like a loosey-goosey sort of understanding of how holistic admissions works. But let's sort of get into the nitty-gritty, like the actual factors that schools are considering when it comes to college admissions. So the most obvious are the ones that we talked about at the outset. Schools, particularly private schools, which is most of the top 20, for example, they're going to be looking at your transcript. So they're going to be looking at things like your GPA, how many A's, B's, C's, et cetera, did you get? They're going to be thinking also about the rigor of those classes. So did you take regular classes? Did you take honors classes? Did you take honors or did you take AP? Some of you guys have honors and you have high honors. So particularly because standardized test scores are so much less important these days because so many schools are test optional, the rigor of your high school curriculum has become really, really important. For schools that rank students where, maybe you're third, fourth, fifth, 15th, whatever the case may be, many schools will ask explicitly about your class rank. And they're also going to be looking at things like your grade trends. So are you on the upswing? Maybe you got into high school and, in ninth grade, you got 1 or 2 Bs. But since then, you've been taking really hard classes and now you've got lots and lots of A's. Or maybe you have the opposite. Maybe instead you started high school really strong and you're in ninth grade, and now in 10th grade you got 1 B, and then in 11th grade you got 3 or 4 Bs, and suddenly you're sort of on a downtrend or a down profile. So colleges really do pay attention to those trends. They also look at what's called the high school profile. So again, this is primarily for private schools. When you submit your application with your transcript, your your high school counselor is going to be submitting what's called a high school profile. So they're going to be giving each college or university information about your school's demographics, about the number of APs or IBs or honors classes that are available at your high school, about any special recognition that your high school has achieved. So when your colleges are evaluating your transcripts, they're also comparing it to what's going on in the rest of your high school profile. So if, for example, 90% of students at your school pass AP Computer Science Principles with a 3 or above, and you pass, maybe that's a little bit less impressive than if you do well in a class where very few of your high school peers are, let's say, passing or doing well in that particular AP exam. Obviously, they will consider your standardized test scores if you are submitting them. And we'll get in a little bit more detail about how they evaluate that at some of these really selective schools. But the long and the short of standardized test scores is there are some schools that require standardized test scores. This is particularly true of schools in Florida and Georgia, but so does MIT and Georgetown. Many, many more schools are test optional now, so they will consider your standardized tests if you submit, and they won't if you don't. And then some schools, like the UCs and California state schools, are test-free, so they will not consider your test at all. They will also consider letters of recommendation. Letters of recommendation can count as an academic factor because your recommenders can be speaking to your academic potential. They're going to be talking about how well you perform usually in an academic class. And of course, your essays can also demonstrate your academic ability as well as other things. Apart from academics, they're also going to be considering some more intangible qualities of who you are. And this is really what we're going to be speaking to in more depth for the rest of this workshop. They're going to be thinking about personal qualities. Are you creative? Do you exhibit determination? Do you work really well in teams? Maybe you have a lot of intercultural competence, a lot of acceptance of other communities. Maybe you have a really strong sense of ethics. Maybe diversity is a really important part of your character. These intangibles are things that really can only be revealed in a couple of places. One of them are going to be your recommendations. So particularly for the most competitive private schools, letters of recommendation are so important, because apart from speaking to your academic ability, they can also demonstrate these other things about yourself. And of course, it's always more convincing when you've got a teacher saying, oh yes, I don't know, Ava, I'm going to pick on you because I know you, I apologize. Ava, she's very, very creative and determined. That's much more convincing than if Ava is the one writing in her essay, oh yes, I'm very creative and very determined, right? So we're really convinced by what other people say. Yes, you are creative and determined, I can see it. Apart from this character, they're also going to be thinking about your context. So where do you come from? And we're going to talk about this in more depth. And how easy or difficult has it been for you to succeed at your high school or in an academic context? Are you a student who lives in a rural area, for example? So let's say you live outside of California and maybe you live in a rural area and your high school doesn't offer a ton of APs and there's not a lot of opportunities around. And maybe you have to work with your parents, or maybe you have to caregive at home, right? There are a lot of things that can affect your capacity to perform well. And it behooves admissions officers to consider those as they're evaluating your application. And I wanted to take a moment to look at the ways in which some schools, and this is particularly true of Harvard, this came out from a lawsuit that occurred with Harvard a few years ago, how Harvard rates its applicants. And what they do is they basically have like 6 different categories that they rate the applicants on. So they think about academics, as we discussed, they think about extracurriculars, they look at athletics, they think about what are called like personal or intellectual qualities, what Stanford sometimes calls intellectual vitality. There's an essay like that. You guys, some of you will see that in the next year or more. They're going to evaluate the rec letters, the recommendation letters, and they may also evaluate the alumni interview, assuming that you choose to accept it. And then of those 6 categories, they give each one a ranking on a scale of 1 to 6, where 1 is the strongest and 6 basically means they haven't even, like they didn't read it, like there's nothing here. So when you're trying to compete on the level of a 1 ranking, a 1 ranking is, for Harvard, you are exceptional. So academically, it means your scores are perfect. You have basically no Bs, straight As. Your test scores are 1600, 1590. You have a national level achievement or professional experience. So this means, let's say, being a finalist in a Regeneron Science Fair, for example. You are, I don't know, competing like in internationals for math Olympiad, something like this. And let's say athletics, that you are an Olympic level athlete. That's sort of what they're looking for a 1. When you're looking at strong credentials, basically you're looking at someone who's got, let's say, mid 700s in each section score. So, you're looking at someone who's right around a 1500. So still good, 33 plus on the ACT. And maybe instead of national level achievements, you sort of got regional level achievements. So maybe you're a Taekwondo champion in your state, something like this. When you get down, solid mid 600s to mid 700s, and this is kind of where our hypothetical applicant was. Maybe you've got school or local level achievement. So maybe you are the leader of a club at your high school, for example. What they call adequate preparation is a lower score on your SAT, so low to mid 600s. Maybe you're still in the, upper, that should say 29, 26 to 29, 26 to 19 ACT makes 0 sense, so I apologize. So a 26 to 29 ACT score, and you're maybe a member in some of your activities. So thinking back to our hypothetical person, that person was maybe a 3 in terms of their academics. And when it comes to their extracurriculars, they're kind of, they're members, they've joined robotics, they're in, track and field, they're involved, but they don't have leadership. And then the last level that's actually read what Harvard readers call marginal potential. So marginal potential suggests that they're not doing too well. I'm very close to the national average in the SAT and ACT, and they're basically not involved in any extracurriculars. But the one I want to jump in and focus on is, okay, so there's some fairly straightforward ways of evaluating academics, extracurriculars, and athletics. There are even some straightforward ways of evaluating rec letters. So are you the most amazing student that teacher has ever taught in the entirety of her career? That's a 1. Are you the most amazing student in the context of that year? That's a 2. The most amazing student in that class. But I think the part that's tricky is thinking about personal or intellectual qualities. So let's jump in there. So Harvard actually has released sort of guidelines for its readers. When we're evaluating students for personal qualities, they say, what they're looking for are truly outstanding qualities of character, perhaps enormous courage in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles in life, demonstrating a singular ability to lead or inspire those around them, extraordinary concern or compassion, or receiving unqualified and unwavering support from their recommenders. So personal qualities is a little bit hard to define, and notice that it includes a number of categories that sort of pushed together in one. And when you're our hypothetical student, you're in a situation where there maybe aren't a lot of things you can change, particularly if you're an older student. I don't know how many students here are juniors. Those of you who are juniors, do you guys mind raising your hands for me? I don't know if you can do that. You should be able to do it with meeting controls. Okay, I see. Okay, I see a couple. Great. It's hard once you're a junior because you don't have a lot of wiggle room to change your GPA. Even if you do really well this second semester of junior year, you can't change it a lot. You have a little bit of time to improve your test score, but even that can be really challenging with the rigors of junior year. And getting to a national level of an extracurricular activity isn't necessarily a super easy thing to do. So thinking about these personal qualities is really where I would want to go next. So let's do that. So this is basically the question of diversity. How are you going to uniquely contribute to this campus? What personal characteristics do you bring? And one thing, this is a language that I use because so many people understand it, but it's kind of language that I despise. This is a little bit about building a personal brand. And a way that I like to think about that is you need to become the student who. Many, particularly top schools, have very little time to evaluate your entire application. So if you read through a giant document, they're looking over all of your activities, they're reading over your essays, and again, for top schools, there may be many, many essays to read through. They're going to be reading over your letters of recommendation, and there can be usually 2 for those schools and often more. They're going to be evaluating your counselor's high school profile. They have 12 minutes, roughly, to do that, 10 to 12 minutes. So it's really important for you to become the student who. You're the student who does what? You're the student who built that app for homeless kids. You're the student who busked in the street. You're the student who washed oil off of the wings of seagulls from some terrible oil spill. So it's really important to think about, how do we do that? Like, how do we build our brand? Now, a lot of students get really anxious about this because sometimes, especially the students that I deal with, some of the things that are given in your life, when it comes to obstacles. Remember, we were talking about context a few slides ago. What is your context? Have you overcome a lot of challenges? Sometimes my students are worried because it feels like there are parts of their identity that they can't change that don't help them in their application. But it's worthwhile to take a moment and evaluate. There are some parts of our identity, things that we, for the most part, cannot change that can be really relevant for college applications. For example, your family's socioeconomic status. Perhaps your family came from poverty. Perhaps you did. Perhaps you guys have really struggled your entire lives. Perhaps you struggled early on in your life. And we talked about the rural-urban divide. Do you live in a place with a lot of resources and a lot of access to, intellectual growth? Or do you live in a rural area where maybe access to those things is more difficult? Race is a really obvious and powerful one. And depending on how young you are, the effects of race on your application may change depending on the outcome of some trials that are occurring right now. But currently, race can matter a great deal, particularly if your racial identity has led to a lot of difficulty, institutional racism that you have struggled against. Perhaps your religion has done something similar. Maybe you're from an unusual religious background and you have experienced persecution. Maybe you're a first-generation college student. That actually matters a lot. If you're the first person in your family who has attended college, many applications will ask about that specifically. Your immigration status can matter. Where did your parents come from? Are you guys refugees? Your gender or gender identity can matter, your sexual orientation. So these are the kinds of things about yourself that maybe you can't change, but they can matter in college applications. And what happens is many of my students will look at this list and they'll say, well, none of these things really apply to me. Maybe I come from a background in which I had a lot of resources, and maybe I live in an urban center where I have resources, and maybe my racial identity doesn't help me too much, and I'm not first generation, whatever the case may be, right? Even if these things, don't apply to you, there are still things that you can do to distinguish yourself in applications, and that has to do with what you can actively do, the things you can change about who you are. Think about what you do and what you love. And that might be apart from that resume of activities that we saw earlier on. So again, the track and field, the robotics, you know, and I sort of have this in order of less to more difficult. Maybe you're someone who writes poetry on the side, or maybe you doodle, you draw and paint. Maybe you have a particular, cultural tradition that you perform in. Maybe you're a singer or a dancer. Maybe like my many engineering students, you're someone who loves to tinker. And parents, if you guys are here, you probably know students who are breaking things, basically taking them apart. And students who have done things like research the lives of mathematicians and try to understand unsolvable math questions. Students who busk, which basically means perform music in public. And those are things that people can kind of do on the side. And from there, they've really developed big projects. I've had students who've published books. I've had students who collaborated with others to create an application, an app for homeless youth so they could identify local youth shelters. I've had lots of students who organize community fundraisers and then donate the funds to an organization that matters to them. And those bigger things are really what we're looking for, right? Those are the things ideally that you want to see if you can engage in, if you can turn the poetry or the singing or the dancing into something like those last. And I think that that's the question that I want to engage with now is how do we do that? And I think the even bigger question is, how do you get started with that process? Like, how do you even begin to think about it? So let's do that. Let's go through a step-by-step process. And for those of you, I spoke to a few of you at the beginning of this, if you have any papers or pencils, or you're taking notes somewhere, this is maybe the place to start taking notes. And if you don't have time to do it in our workshop, then definitely this is an activity that I want you guys to engage in at home. For those of you who have counselors, do this with your counselor. So this is where we actually build a passion project. This is where you figure out what it is that you can do. And I think the first step is to evaluate where you are now. Take an inventory of who you are and what you like to do. So everyone, I want you to maybe take a moment and I want you to start thinking first about some of those givens that we spoke about, the special identity categories. When you think about who you are, is there anything that pops out in your head? A racial identity, a religious identity, a cultural identity, maybe your gender, and particularly this is important, gender in the context of your interests. Women in STEM, women in computer science, these are really underrepresented identities. Same thing with certain races. Are you, for example, Black or Latinx and pursuing engineering? I mean, those are things that can matter. Think about particular talents that you possess. And maybe these are things that you haven't pursued in a while. I have a lot of students who were interested in activities when they were young. Maybe they played an instrument, or maybe they loved drawing or poetry, and then, high school hits and it's really hard to pursue in depth. But I want you to think about what some of those talents are. Do you have any particular interests, perhaps, or skills? I want you to think about your hobbies, any preferences. For example, I had a student, for example, a couple of years ago, who I didn't realize was really interested in recreating Stone Age tools. And I'm so sad that I found out about that far too late. I didn't realize until after we had gone through most of his applications. But anything that you engage in, and this, again, may not be part of your typical resume of high school activities, that you tend to do more than your peers, more than your friends, more than the rest of your family. So let's say, for example, we'll just take a hypothetical case. Let's say that unlike me, your special talent is singing, and you have a really beautiful singing voice, and music is your interest. So you've identified one of your talents. What do we do from there? I want you to take a step away from you, and I want you to think about a cause. And I want you to start by thinking about causes in the broadest terms. So I have, for example, a lot of students who are really, really interested in animals and animal welfare, kids who are worried about how animals are treated. I have a lot of students who care about the environment and are really worried about things like fires or droughts. Obviously, I'm based in California, so I have a lot of California-based students who are concerned about those things. Students who are concerned about plastics and littering. Maybe it's concerns about your school. I've had students who've expressed concerns about lunch programs available at their school, or the ways in which food is distributed, or accessibility at their school. Maybe you're really concerned about homelessness. We have a lot of students who volunteer for homeless shelters. Mental health is a really, really big one. There's been a rise in mental health crises. Maybe you're concerned about public health in general, or healthcare access. Maybe you're concerned about the many, many war refugees or refugees of drought and famine around the world. Maybe you're concerned about poverty in sort of a grand scale. There are many, many, many things to worry about in the world. And I don't want you to write a list of every single thing, because I'm sure that if any of us pauses and thinks about all of the problems I have on this list, whatever, 6 or 7 these are, sure, every single one of them is a problem. I want you to identify, let's say, the 3 or 4 that are things that you're really anxious about. So, for me, I'm always worried about the environment and am I recycling, properly? And maybe for you, you're worried about homelessness. So just take a moment for those of you who are taking notes, and I want you to jot down those, 2 to 4 things, broad categories that are things that worry you. Once you've done that, as I'm sure you've guessed, the next step is you have to get specific. So let's say we decide that what we're really concerned about is mental health. And, this has been a huge issue, particularly for teenagers in recent years, with the pandemic, with virtual schooling. There have been so many problems with mental health. But mental health by itself is a huge category. And for whatever category it is that you're dealing with, I want you to start thinking about some of those W questions that I'm sure you guys learned about in elementary school. And one of the things that I like to start with is who. Okay, so who are the people who are struggling with this problem? So if it's mental health, maybe you're really concerned about your peers, teens who are not going to school because they're overwhelmed with depression or anxiety, or it's your friends who are over exercising or under eating because they are overwhelmed by the images that they see on, I don't know, TikTok and Instagram. Start thinking about, who is it who's being affected by this particular problem? For example, I've had students who are interested in homelessness, and they were interested in questions of, okay, how do racial categories of homelessness develop? Why are there different percentages of people who are homeless at different rates based on race, right? So you want to start thinking about, who is it that I am concerned about? And then if you can, ideally, you want to start thinking about, okay, but what is the actual problem? Like, what are they dealing with? So let's say we're concerned about teens who are experiencing mental health issues. What type of mental health issues? Are you concerned with anxiety or depression? Are you worried about eating disorders, for example? Are you concerned about over-exercising, body dysmorphia? Are you concerned about, I don't know, hypochondria? Whatever it is, I want you to start thinking about how you can narrow that range down. And you may also wish to narrow it down a bit further by geographic location. Where, are you worried about teens in America? Are you worried about teens in your high school? Are you worried about teens in your neighborhood or in your state? If you can narrow that down a little bit more, that would be ideal. So let's say, my father is an immigrant. If I were a teenager, perhaps what I would be concerned about is American teens whose parents are immigrants, who experience a lot of anxiety and depression, but whose anxiety and depression is perhaps ignored by their larger immigrant communities because they have a different conception of mental health. So now I've gone from these giant categories, right, which are so huge, if you're trying to solve mental health, whatever that means, that feels really, really impossible, to a much smaller category that says, I'm looking at teens from immigrant communities, and perhaps I would get even more specific, right? My father is from the Middle East, so maybe I'm concerned about teens from the Middle East who experience anxiety and depression that's largely ignored or belittled by their Middle Eastern community. So now you've got a couple of things, right? So we basically figured out your initial skill set, which maybe it's music and singing, and we sort of identified a problem, which is mental health, and in particular, anxiety and depression experienced by immigrant communities. So now what you want to do is you want to start developing, this is a plan of action, but honestly, when you're first starting out, you want to come up with a few plans of action. And these are some examples of things that some of my students have actually done. So for example, let's say you're someone who's really interested in psychology, or maybe you're interested in neuroscience, or maybe you want to be a doctor and you want to be a biology major, any of these things. You can use your major, and maybe you're a really academic minded person. Maybe your goal would be to do academic research on the effects of music on anxiety. And you would have a bunch of ways of doing that. Maybe you could do your own small scale study. Maybe you can join a summer program where basically you have a mentor and that mentor helps you develop your study. Ideally, or the best case scenario would be that you take on a faculty mentor, maybe through an informal professor internship, although those are getting harder and harder to get. And you would do this research maybe over the course of a year or two or more. And ideally, ultimately, you would get published. You would write a paper in which you were one of the co-authors, or at least mentioned in the paper, and your paper is published in a peer-reviewed academic journal. I mean, that's the ideal circumstance. Maybe you want to do something a little bit smaller scale. Maybe you're actually a really amazing musician and you're a singer. Maybe what you can do is you can do a music performance, a fundraiser. And I've had students do this at various levels. I've had students do fundraisers at the school level, or maybe they live in a community, right? A particular housing community, and they organize it at their housing community. I've had students who've done really, really large scale fundraisers where they worked with multiple schools and community colleges and created huge fundraisers, and then use that money to donate to a particular organization that matters to them. So in this case, if our concern is anxiety and depression among teens, you would find an organization that deals with mental health. Maybe you want to do something that's even more sort of intimate or focused on your community. Maybe you are at a church or a temple and you're concerned about the kids in this particular organization. So maybe what you can do is you do a survey of the mental well-being of the kids at your temple or church, and then maybe you create a choir, and then you do surveys over the course of the time that kids are in that choir to see sort of what the effects of that is. And that sort of straddles both academic research and sort of an active, involvement. The idea is to come up with a few ideas if you can. You're not going to do all of them. You cannot do all of them. And the one that you choose is really going to depend on how much time you have. How much time you have before you apply to be, quite realistic, and the resources around you. It's, much harder to do very serious academic research if you're having a really hard time finding a good faculty mentor, for example. So once you come up with a few potential ideas that focus on your specific skills or interests and a particular cause or larger cause, now the next step is to build a team. I mean, I have a lot of students who I think feel so overwhelmed when we talk about passion projects or, helping them make a difference. And I think recognizing that students who are successful in large scale ways are not successful in isolation. Almost every student that I work with who's done very serious academic research or worked on a huge project has resources behind them. That can be really close teachers. Maybe you come up with an idea that you turn into a club at your school, and now your teacher advisor can help you. Maybe you have a group of friends who also want to get leadership positions, and that would be overlapping with school peers or clubs. If you're really interested in doing work in your community at let's say a local religious or ethnic organization, then your parents or your family are going to be a really great resource because they can help you reach out to leadership. Students can also be really successful if you reach out to other local groups and organizations. I have a lot of students who are interested, for example, in STEM education to younger students. And so they'll often reach out to local elementary schools to set up like tutoring programs or teaching programs. And oftentimes schools are really, really receptive to that. And of course, particularly if you're choosing to do something that's more academic or intellectually oriented, doing research on professors who are doing work in your field, ideally at either a local university or a university that you're really interested in attending. Reach out to those faculty, let them know what your interests are, ask them for assistance, and oftentimes you can get involved in research, and sometimes you can even sort of build a mentorship relationship with them. As I said. So to summarize, okay, When you're thinking about standing out in college applications, you know, the most obvious, I mean, the not easiest thing to do would be just gain national or international levels of recognition. Do something where you are really pointy, in the words of some admissions experts. That's a really hard thing to do, though. So I think apart from that, so unless you're already on the path of becoming an Olympic level athlete, I think it's a good idea for you to first pause and take stock of your skills and interests. Connect those skills and interests to a social cause or to some sort of community need. And ideally, the more local it is to you, the better. Something that you can tell a story about. And then build a team to help you grow your idea and give yourself time to do that. Um, if you're a junior, again, I know one of you mentioned that you still have time to do some of these projects. The earlier you sort of begin to identify your special interests, I think that the bigger that can be. And that's it for me, guys. Thank you so much for your attendance. If you are interested in asking me any questions, as I mentioned before, my email address is svaton@meridianprep.com. I'm going to chat it right here. And if you're interested, we also do offer free initial meetings. You're welcome to use this link here, meridianprep.com/free initial meeting with little dashes in between. And you can meet with a counselor and talk to them about your questions and concerns. It's completely free. You don't have to sign up. Any questions? Please feel free to chat them over to me or to unmute yourself. I'm going to turn off the recording.